Hello, and welcome to the 6th webinar in our series on Greek painting in context, organized and produced here at the American School of Classical Studies at Athens. My co-moderator is Dimitris Plantzos of the University of Athens, and at the end of the lecture, he will pose your questions to our speaker. Please use the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. This will be our last webinar in the series for the time being because we have had to postpone the one on ancient Corinth. Please note that there will be no webinar on April 15th. It is now a truly great pleasure for me to introduce a friend, colleague, and co-collaborator on a number of projects. Emerita Professor of the University of Athens, Olga Palagia. Olga taught at the University of Athens for nearly 40 years, during which time she also managed to deliver over 100 papers at international conferences, of which she co-organized 18, many with directors of the American School of Classical Studies. Her scholarship is legion, and she has spoken on every continent except possibly Antarctica. She's not afraid of controversy. Her article with Eugene Borza on the occupant of Tomb 2 at Vergina, which argues that it is not that of Philip, is a required reading on all our school trips to Macedonia. Anyone who has delved into the vast topic of Greek sculpture knows her major works on the pediments of the Parthenon and the function, materials, and techniques of Greek sculpture published by Cambridge, and most recently a voluminous edited handbook of Greek sculpture, a mere 800 pages with over 400 illustrations, published by De Gruyter in 2019. Her individual studies of works of art range from Samothrace to Sparta, from the Piraeus bronzes to Alexander the Great in Central Asia. Keep your eye out here for Alexander in today's lecture. So you well may ask, why is she speaking about painting in the late 4th century Macedonia? Olga's first publication, her doctoral thesis at Oxford, was on the sculptor and painter Euphrynor, and she has never abated her interest in painting of the Hellenistic period. Fortunately, many paintings are well preserved in underground vaulted tombs, and we will hear today about their imagery and its relation to the funerary context. And now I turn it over to Professor Palagia.
Monumental painting, was one of the major arts of the ancient Greek world. We hear about it and about the great painters of antiquity from the literary sources. Unfortunately, those masterpieces have perished because they were painted on wooden panels. By a stroke of luck, echoes of some of those works have come down to us in the past half-century, thanks to the excavations of underground chamber tombs of the late 4th and 3rd centuries BC in Macedonia. The finest of these tombs are decorated with wall paintings of high quality, either on the façades or within the burial chambers, or both. They are either cist tombs built of ashlar masonry and accessible from the roof, or underground chambers covered with a barrel vault and embellished with a monumental façade imitating a propylon or gateway. Barrel-vaulted tombs are known as Macedonian tombs and are usually accessible through an outdoor corridor and a marble door. Because the tombs were occasionally used for multiple family burials, the doors were both decorative and also functional. Macedonian tombs were covered with artificial mounds of earth known as tumuli. We do not know if their facades remained visible and for how long. However, a few of the pictorial motifs represented in some rather inaccessible tombs of Hellenistic Macedonia were adapted in murals or mosaics of Roman Italy. This indicates the existence of a prototype somewhere on the Greek mainland, from where it was transmitted to Macedonia and later to the Roman world. In addition, the high quality of Macedonian wall paintings suggests that they were created by accomplished artists who did not learn their trade on the spot, but were invited from established artistic centers. We will discuss the context of a small selection of Macedonian wall paintings. We begin with two examples originating in different contexts and adapted by the Macedonians into their funerary art. The rape of Persephone at the top of the screen is borrowed from the religious repertoire of Greek sanctuaries, while the coronation of the victor at the bottom of the screen derives from athletic or civic dedications. We will next discuss the reading of sacred texts in preparation for the afterlife, a theme that was first developed in Athenian funerary art, and we'll conclude with the judgment of souls in Hades, a concept that was explained by Plato, but only illustrated in the tombs of Macedonia. The heyday of Macedonian painting, as we know it, coincides with the reigns of Alexander the Great and his successors, roughly between 336 and 280 BC, when painting was dominated by the school of Athens, headed by Nicomachos, Aristides, and Nicias, and by the school of Rhodes, headed by Apelles. These artists were responsible for a number of innovations, like cast shadows, but continued to deploy their compositions in a shallow field. Apelles and Nicomachos, in particular, practiced the so-called four-color palette of white, black, red, and yellow, and their combinations. Nicomachos made a name for himself by developing a technique of rapid execution, which implies a quasi-impressionistic style. Panel painters were traditionally employed by sanctuaries or cities to embellish sacred or civic buildings, like temples or stoas. Their subject matter were gods and heroes, battle pieces, and occasionally portraits. The patronage of the Macedonians introduced a change of direction as the artists were called upon to decorate palaces and private houses, and by extension the last dwelling places of the elite, underground chambered tombs. It is interesting to compare and contrast the funerary iconography of the Macedonians, as expressed in their wall paintings, with that of the Athenians, as expressed in their grave reliefs. Athenian grave reliefs of the classical period tend to represent secular scenes, like family gatherings, with the occasional battle scene for those who fell in action. And yet the Athenians were deeply devout. A large proportion of the population was initiated into the Eleusinian mysteries, which promised a blissful afterlife. Do we get any glimpses of their privileged status as initiates in their funerary monuments? Do their memorials project any eschatological overtones? Rarely, if at all. The Athenians were generally very discreet about their involvement in mystery cults. We see no divine figures on their funerary monuments, with the exception of Hermes, who is sometimes shown leading the deceased on their journey to the underworld. The Lekithos of Myrine in the Athens National Museum, attributed to a priestess of Athena Nike, is a classic example of the privileged dead who is escorted by Hermes. But scenes related to mystery cults were usually reserved for sacred spaces. A famous panel painting of the Rape of Persephone, attributed to the Athenian painter Nicomachos, was much admired in the Roman period and was eventually taken to Rome and dedicated in the Cell of Minerva, which was inside the Temple of Jupiter on the Capitoline Hill. It is very likely that this panel originally stood in the sanctuary of Demeter and Kore at Eleusis. The Persephone theme, which in the rest of Greece was deemed appropriate only for sanctuaries, was adapted to serve a funerary function in Macedonia. The earliest surviving example, which is also the earliest funerary mural from Macedonia so far, was painted on one of the walls of a Sis tomb in Vergina, the ancient capital of Aigai, and it is dated to the third quarter of the 4th century. This tomb is now known as Vergina Tomb I, or the Tomb of Persephone, and is located between Tomb 2, or so-called Philip's tomb, and an overground Heron. 3 of its walls carry murals painted on 3 layers of colored stucco. One wall is decorated with the Rape of Persephone. The adjacent wall represents her grieving mother, Demeter, and the third wall shows 3 women, perhaps the 3 Fates. All 4 female figures are shown seated. In the main scene, Pluto rides a 4-horse chariot carrying a resisting Persephone. Her companion, left behind, crouches in amazement, while Hermes leads the chariot with the thunderbolt of Zeus crashing before him to indicate the god's approval. The warm, glowing colors of the painting are a result of the artist's choice of a restricted palette of reds and yellows mixed in a variety of ways. It recalls the traditional 4-color technique practiced by both Nicomachos of Athens and Apelles of Rhodes. The extensive use of incised outlines, some being enhanced by hatching, is unusual in Macedonian wall paintings and indicates the presence of an artist from Greece who was invited to execute a special commission. The iconography is familiar from a late 5th century relief from Athens, showing the abduction of the heroine Iasili by the hero Echelos, their chariot being led by Hermes, though not to the underworld because the chariot is going uphill. This relief was dedicated to the shrine of Kiphisos in Phaleron. The composition reflects wedding scenes in Attic vase painting, where the bride and groom ride a chariot or a cart to the bridegroom's house. In an Attic Lutrophorus in Berlin, we see the bridegroom carrying his bride to the chariot, while the charioteer steadies the horses. So the rape of Persephone is ultimately understood as part of a wedding ritual, albeit the bride is not exactly willing. But the metaphysical overtones of the imagery in Tomb 1 are clear. The soul of the departed, wedded to the king of Hades himself, is led by Hermes to a privileged position in the afterlife. A composition originating as a dedication in a sacred space is here adapted by the Macedonians into an allegory of salvation. There are no Eleusinian mysteries in Macedonia, and we do not know where and how were the Macedonians initiated into mystery cults. But unlike the Athenians, the Macedonians obviously had no constraints in using mystic imagery in their graves. It has been argued that the rape of Persephone in Vergina is a reflection of the famous panel of the Athenian Nicomachos, perhaps executed by a member of his workshop. The adaptation of the theme for funerary purposes was taken up by a rather inferior floor mosaic decorating the second chamber of the Casta tomb at Amphipolis. The date of the tomb is disputed, but there is no doubt that the mosaic postdates the tomb of Persephone in Vergina. The funerary function of the rape of Persephone is carried over to Imperial Rome, where we have 2 mosaic versions and 1 mural, all from cemeteries. One mosaic is in the Roman cemetery under the Church of St. Peter's in Rome, and the mural comes from the tomb of the Nasoni and is now in the British Museum. The mosaics are rather close to the Vergina variant, and as Macedonian tomb paintings could not have been accessible to artists in Imperial Rome, we can draw the conclusion that they are dependent on the prototype that inspired the Vergina painting, probably Nicomachos' panel that had been removed to Rome. We now move to another motif originating in a different context that was borrowed by the funerary iconography of the Macedonians. The facade of Bella, Tomb 2 in Vergina, dated to the 3rd century BC, is decorated with a painting showing a warrior in the center being offered a wreath by a tall woman on the right and attended by a male figure sitting on a pile of shields on the left. Beyond the open door of the tomb, we can see a marble throne, its back painted on the wall. The tomb was excavated by Manolis Andronikos, but he died before he had a chance to publish it. Before we discuss the scene on the tomb facade, let me say a few words about the coronation motif, which is not a funerary motif. The award of a wreath was in fact invented in Greek art to illustrate honors bestowed on victorious athletes. On the left is a drawing of a now lost late archaic Attic lekithos, illustrating an athlete's coronation. In the 5th century, crowns came to symbolize civic and other honors, and towards the end of the Peloponnesian War, crowns were also awarded to victorious generals. After he defeated the Athenian fleet at Aegispotami, the Spartan general Lysander dedicated in Delphi a statue of himself being crowned by Poseidon. Attic record reliefs of the 4th century often carry coronation scenes, as this example on the right in the Athens Epigraphical Museum dating from 322 BC, where Bouli and Deimos crown Asclepiodoros, who was an ambassador of Phokis to Athens. In the Hellenistic period, the coronation motif is reserved for rulers. A classic example is the so-called porous decadrachm minted by Alexander the Great in 323 BC, where he is shown crowned by Nike. The literary sources record statues of Hellenistic kings being crowned by personifications. Going back to the facade of the Bella tomb, the deceased on the left is represented as a warrior wearing boots, a cuirass decorated with a gorgonion, a short chiton, and a military cloak wrapped around his torso. He holds an inverted spear in his right hand. His left hand is placed on his hip. His pose has been compared to that of Lysippos' portrait of Alexander the Great holding a lance, which is reflected in a bronze statuette from Egypt, now in the Louvre, on the right. The warrior is frontal, flanked by 2 figures in profile who look directly at him. A tall woman on the right offers him a wreath. She is dressed in a chiton with short sleeves and seems to wear a Stephanie. A young man on the left, shown sitting on a pile of shields, wears a chiton with long sleeves and a himation wrapped around his lower body. His right hand is supported by his sword, and his left is extended forward. A round shield rests by his side. The shield device is a bird that is usually described as an eagle. However, despite the heavy weathering, we can still make out the round head and symmetrically arranged wings, which help identify the bird as a siren. Sirens are more appropriate in a funerary context and were popular not only in the art of Athens, but also in Macedonia. The sarcophagus of the Belevi tomb near Ephesus, on the right, dated to the 3rd century, is decorated with images of sirens. The pile of shields on which the young man sits can be understood as a trophy taken from the defeated enemy. We need only cite the famous statue of Aetolia personified, which was erected by the Aetolians in the sanctuary of Apollo at Delphi after they defeated the invading Gauls in 279 BC. Aetolia was shown seated on a pile of Gaulish arms, including shields, as attested by the surviving statue base of the monument. The Aetolians placed the image on their coins in commemoration of their great victory. The image of the victor stepping on his opponent's shields reappears in the 2nd century BC. We have 2 examples, both involving Gaulish shields. First is a standing statue of Apollo from Delos, trampling Gaulish shields underfoot, no doubt dedicated after another victory against the Gauls. And second, the last Attalid king of Pergamon, Attalos III, after he returned home from a victorious military campaign against the Gauls, had a statue erected in his honor, wearing a cuirass and stepping on the enemy's spoils. The statue is now lost, but it is documented by an inscription. If we look closely at the shields on which the young man sits, it becomes clear that they cannot be round, hoplite shields, because the figure sits at some distance from the shield's edge, visible on the left. they are more likely to be oblong Gaulish shields. The identity of the young man has been hotly debated. The god of war, Ares, or a personification of war, or the eponymous hero of Macedon, or even Alexander the Great have all been proposed. Two features here argue in favor of Alexander. The young man wears a Persian long-sleeved chiton, which implies a mixed Greek and Persian costume, like the one adopted by Alexander the Great after his defeat of Darius III. In addition, his profile, especially the hairstyle with anastole, his longish hair and depression for the addition of a diadem, matches other posthumous representations of Alexander. For example, the coin types of Lysimachus on the right. Alexander the Great, of course, did not fight against the Gauls. The Gaulish spoils can only belong to the warrior in the center of the scene, who must have participated in the victorious battle against the Gauls near the city of Lysimachia in 277 BC, where Antigonus Gonatas drove the Gauls out of the kingdom of Macedonia and gained the throne for himself. Finally, the woman offering a wreath to the warrior may be either a personification, as has often been suggested, or a priestess meeting a triumphant ruler at the city gates and offering him a golden crown, a ritual which is very well documented by Hellenistic inscriptions and literary sources. The exact date of this tomb within the 3rd century is unknown. The young age of the warrior does not have to reflect his appearance at the time of his death. His coronation may not necessarily signify posthumous heroization, as has often been suggested, but may be explained as a memorial of honors to the victor of a military campaign that were bestowed during his lifetime. If we recognize the shields as Gaulish, then we are dealing with the commemoration of the Battle of Lysimachia in 277. And it is just possible that the scene on the facade of the Bella tomb depends on a monument erected in honor of the victor. Although the Bella tomb is commonly attributed to a Macedonian general, it may well be that the presence of a posthumous portrait of Alexander the Great, sitting on the spoils of war gained by the deceased, is an allusion to royalty. A further token of royalty is the marble throne situated within the tomb. The vanquisher of the Gauls and liberator of Greece, Antigonus Gonatas, springs to the mind. Even though he defeated the Gauls in his youth and died as king of Macedonia in ripe old age, the memory of his great victory was kept alive. And this is very well attested by a dedication of stelae documenting his triumph 30 years after the event in the temple of Athena Nike on the Athenian Acropolis. It is not impossible that the same victory was commemorated by a coronation scene on his grave. We finally move on to images related to the afterlife that are truly appropriate to funerary art. As we pointed out in the beginning of this talk, the mystery cults of Demeter and Kore, as well as the mysteries of Dionysus, promised their devotees a privileged position in Hades and prepared them for their underworld journey. The initiates of these mysteries had to study sacred texts which guided their steps and provided them with the correct answers to the questions posed by the judges of the underworld and by the king and queen of the underworld, Pluto and Persephone. Instructions on how to proceed in the underworld have been found written on gold tablets and placed in graves in Macedonia, Thessaly, Crete, and Magna Graecia. Glimpses of the initiate's preparation for the afterlife, but not of the actual underworld journey, can be detected already in Athenian funerary art. Although Aristophanes in his Frogs was able to see the comic side of that solemn journey and share it with the spectators of the theater of Dionysus in Athens, the art of Athens avoided this topic until it found a niche in Macedonian tomb paintings. The funerary monument of the Athenian orator is Socrates, who died in 338 BC, has not come down to us, but is described in the lives of the 10 orators. It consisted of a tall column supporting a siren, as well as of a marble trapeza showing a relief scene of Isocrates and his teachers. Gorgias, the sophist, was specifically said to be gazing at a globe with Isocrates standing beside him. A comparable relief scene of a gathering of men, though they hold no attributes, can be found on the base of a 4th century funerary vessel from Athens, which is now in the Acropolis Museum. More explicit is the relief frieze from the Hellenistic funerary monument of Hieronymus of Tlos, which is now in the Berlin Museum. The frieze is broken at the left, but enough remains to see a gathering of men sitting on a semicircular exedra. One man holds a book roll, another points a radius at a globe on the ground. The next scene on the right depicts Hermes introducing a dead man to Persephone and Pluto, who sits on his throne. Beyond Pluto, we see an underworld scene with the dead sitting on rocks, attended by a winged woman, very likely Psyche, the soul, and the personification of the earth rising from the ground. Judging from the underworld scenes on the right half of the frieze, we can interpret the scene on the left as a meeting of initiates of a mystery cult studying sacred texts in preparation for the afterlife. The globe may be understood as presenting the topography of the underworld, and this is explained in a pseudo-Platonic dialogue called Axiokos. The theme of devotees reading from sacred texts explored by Athenian funerary art was apparently transplanted into Macedonia and absorbed into a different social environment. The so-called Philosopher's Tomb is a schist tomb excavated in Pella in 2001 and promptly published by its excavator Maria Akamati. She interpreted the iconography as a philosophical gathering. This tomb dates from the 3rd century BC and functioned as a family burial place because it contained the remains of a man, a woman, and a child. The 4 walls of the tomb are decorated with the main scene of 6 or 7 men who sit or stand reading from book rolls, one of them pointing at a globe. A narrow frieze at the top shows a horse race taking place in a cemetery, which is signposted by burial mounds topped by stelae. In one instance, we see a stele supporting a cinerary vessel, and you see that on the left. There can be little doubt that what we see here are funeral games. These games are documented in Macedonia by the literary sources recording the history of Alexander the Great and his successors. It is also documented by a painted frieze showing a chariot race in the antechamber of Tomb 3 in Vergina. The west wall of the Philosopher's Tomb is dominated by a single figure, his left foot stepping on an elevation. He is beardless, wreathed with leaves, and wears a red himation and boots. The lack of beard is no indication of young age, as Alexander the Great had introduced the fashion of shaving one's chin, and this seems to have continued for a while at least in Macedonia, even for older men. The man in the red cloak points a radius at a blue globe which rests in a box. This figure is the earliest surviving depiction of someone pointing at a globe. We have already mentioned that Gorgias pointed at a globe in the funerary monument of Isocrates, but that is now lost to us. The north wall of the Pella tomb shows two men, but only one is well preserved. We see a bearded man sitting on a rock. He is wreathed and wears boots and a purple chiton and a yellowish himation. He reads from a book roll held open on his lap. Near his feet we see two more book rolls. Another pair of men is shown on the south wall. On the right we see a man wearing a wreath and a himation and boots sitting frontally. He has a short beard and sideburns, but no moustache. His companion on the left is damaged, but we can make out a beardless man wearing a wreath, also sitting. The east wall, which I'm not showing you, preserved the remnants of a seated figure with a beard holding a staff. It is unclear whether a seventh figure was also shown on that wall. This scene is ultimately inspired by a painting, which is also reflected in two Roman mosaics. The better preserved mosaic found in Pompeii is now in the Naples Museum. It is popularly known as the Seven Sages mosaic and depicts four old men sitting on a marble exedra, while another man stands behind them and two more stand at either side of the exedra. Some hold book rolls, while the man at the center points at a globe which is inside a box. A half-open box, probably holding more book rolls, rests on the ground near the left. Behind the men grows a tree, which is flanked by a column topped by a sundial. On the left, we also see two pillars supporting an entablature that holds four bronze vessels. Their shape suggests that they are cinerary urns, by analogy with several examples known from Campanian wall paintings. On the left is a painting from Herculaneum showing a cinerary urn on top of a column in what is obviously a cemetery scene, because another column is shown on the left. Two hens peck at a pomegranate in the foreground, another symbol of the underworld. The sundial also is used as a symbol of transition to another world and is therefore an appropriate image for a cemetery. The grave relief of Theodotos of Byzantium in the Istanbul Museum, dating from the 1st century BC, comprises both the globe at which points the deceased at the bottom of the scene and the sundial, which is held up by a sphinx at the left top of the relief. At the top right of the mosaic in Naples, we see a landscape reminiscent of a walled city. It has been variously interpreted as the Athenian Acropolis, Acrocorinth, or the Nile Valley, and by implication, the gathering of the seven men has been labeled Plato's Academy, the seven sages headed by Periander, or the Museum of Alexandria. However, we have here two items referring us to a cemetery, the cinerary urns and the sundial. I therefore suggest that the mosaic derives from a funerary painting depicting a gathering of initiates discussing sacred texts related to the afterlife and studying the topography of the underworld. This painting may have also inspired the main scene of the Pella tomb. As to how this painting became a popular subject for domestic decoration in Roman Italy, It may well be that the patrons actually thought that the scene showed the 7 sages. The scene is at any rate rooted in Athenian funerary art. We conclude with a theme developed in Athenian literature, which, however, found its visual expression in Macedonia: the judgment of souls in the underworld. We have seen how the initiates studied sacred texts in order to be able to answer the questions of the underworld judges. Plato says that Rhadamanthys, Iacchos, and Minos were the judges of the underworld. Minos and Rhadamanthys tried the souls of those who died in Asia, while Iacchos tried those who died in Europe. Homer and Pindar inform us that the soul's ultimate goal was to reach the realm of Rhadamanthys, who presided over the Elysian fields. A poem written by Poseidipos, a native of Pella, expresses his wish to have his statue reading from a book roll erected in the Agora of Pella after his death, while he would take the initiate's path leading to Rhadamanthys. Another poet, Hegesippus, explains how the virtues were led by Hermes straight to Rhadamanthys. Aristophanes, in his Frogs, gives us a humorous account of Dionysus' descent into the underworld. Before embarking on his trip, Dionysus consults Heracles, who had already been there and back. What he really wants to know is the location of fast food joints along the way. Dionysus finally arrives and knocks on the door of the underworld, disguised as Heracles, because he believes that the lion skin will ease his way in. The judge Iacchos answers the door. "Who is it?" he asks. "The mighty Heracles," answers Dionysus, only to be met with incredible abuse because Heracles had stolen Cerberus and never brought him back. Dionysus did not follow the right guide, for it was Hermes and not Heracles who led the souls to Hades. Unlike Dionysus, the Macedonians had done their homework. A judgment in the underworld is painted on 4 panels flanking the entrance of the so-called Judgment Tomb in Leucadia. The tomb dates from about 300 BC and has a Doric façade with metopes and an Ionic frieze, as well as an Ionic upper order topped by a pediment. The painted metopes show a battle of Greeks and centaurs, while a battle of Greeks and Persians is represented in a plaster relief frieze higher up. The façade gives the impression of an ornamental gateway, presumably the gate to Hades. Looking at the panels from left to right, we see a dead warrior introduced by Hermes, leader of the privileged souls, to the seated Iacchos, judge in charge of deaths in Europe. The standing Rhadamanthys closes the scene, signifying that the deceased has secured a blessed afterlife. The names of the 2 judges and of Hermes are written over their heads, but the deceased is unfortunately not named. The battle of Greeks and Persians, represented in the frieze, suggests that the tomb belonged to one of the companions of Alexander the Great, who survived the Asian campaign to die peacefully at home and reach the paradise of Rhadamanthys. The gateway to Hades may also be taken as a warning to the visitor. The same principle applies to the painting on the pediment over the entrance to the tomb of the Palmites, another 3rd century tomb in Leucadia. Pluto and Persephone face the viewers as they try to make their way into the tomb. Pluto holds a large key, symbolizing his power to hold the dead perpetually in his realm. But perhaps the visitors have memorized the right answers and are headed for a blissful afterlife. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Palagia, for this authoritative, as always, extremely lucid and very perceptive presentation of this fascinating talk about the afterlife in the context of Macedonian painting, and for posing all these questions regarding the transmittance of the transferring of philosophical ideals from Athens to Macedon in those days. I would like to encourage our audience to send us their questions through the Q&A panel. Please avoid the chat panel because it's not as easy to moderate. But let me start the Q&A with the question about the four-color palette, which you mentioned. Obviously, this is a great mystery for anyone working on Greek painting. The idea that, according to our literary sources, some painters preferred to use only four colors. I agree with you. I think you tend to associate the tetrachromy, the four-color palette, with a stylistic preference, sort of virtuosité show-off, perhaps, or tradition. Would you like to comment on that?
Well, I think the four-color palette is also an indication of chronology because it doesn't seem to go on for very long. It belongs mostly to the generation of the painters of the time of Alexander the Great. And I believe it was a question of choice. They restricted themselves to only these colors for a reason. And we can understand this reason when we look at the Persephone wall painting. It's quite luminous. It really gives a very luminous aspect to the painting, but it disappears. This eccentric, let's say, choice of colors disappears in the 3rd century.
Thank you. There is a question regarding iconography from Robert Sutton. Even if Attic tomb sculpture avoids divine and related mortuary themes and daily life themes, they do appear on Attic white ground from tombs, possibly providing a link to the Vergina tombs in similar medium. Could there have been lost painted wooden panels too?
Yes, I believe there were paintings, funerary paintings. I already said so. I believe that the Naples mosaic is dependent on a funerary painting. So they must have had a way of displaying such paintings. And we have to remember the very expensive tomb of the girlfriend of Harpalos, whose tomb was like an aiskos. So we can believe that it contained paintings in there. And the white ground lithoi do show Hermes, and they also show Charon taking, with his boat, taking the dead people to the other side. And yes, I think they are dependent on pictorial prototypes.
Thank you. Going back to those prototypes, a question from Anthony Tice. My thanks to Professor Palagia for a wonderful presentation. My question is about individuality versus standardization. It seems there is an amazing variety of paintings and themes, almost a culture of bespoke decoration. What are we to make of this? what does it say about the Macedonian elite that they didn't have a standardized repertoire of decorations?
Well, I think they have a very eclectic taste, and they bring over artists from elsewhere. So that is why we have such a great variety, because we have artists from Rhodes, I think from Kos, from Athens, from Sicyon, all over Greece. So it depends on the individual taste of the patron. And that is why we have such a great variety, and we do not have a standardized approach, because we do not have a local school. I don't think that we have a local school of painters. We have itinerant painters who are invited from elsewhere. And so they bring all these motifs. And I'm sure more tombs will be discovered. And we will see other themes that we haven't even imagined that were really exploited in Macedonia.
Well, I must say that when the Amphipolis tomb was about to be revealed, I was kind of hoping for some wall paintings there. There are some, but nothing as spectacular as Regina, of course. A question from Evridiki Kefalidou. Thank you for this rich and thought-provoking lecture. I understand your arguments about the possible sources of inspiration of Macedonian tomb paintings that is mainly imported from Athens and Athenian art. However, we know that King Archelaus had invited the famous painter Zeuxis to decorate the Pella Palace, something that took quite some time and apparently many assistants. Could this have been the beginning of a local important workshop?
No, I don't think that Zeuxis created the workshop. I think he came, did his job and left. And of course, the same is true of Euripides. He came to Macedonia and produced some plays, and he died there, but I don't think he left anybody who followed in his footsteps in Macedonia. I really think that they didn't create any schools, these artists.
I think your comparison with literature and the written word is quite revealing, because next to all this, there's philosophy. And of course, you showed very well how their ideas about the afterworld came perhaps from Athenian ideas about death and the afterlife. And of course, Aristotle was there during Alexander's youth, teaching all this through Plato and his laws. And so this is how they got the idea. But as you say, they did not necessarily create a school of their own in either philosophy or painting. Perhaps Professor Niles would like to pose a question at this moment.
Thank you. I noticed a question at the very top, which you may have skipped, and it had to do with Hermes. The question is whether Hermes is leading the chariot with his left hand, and this is in contrast to wedding scenes where the groom grabs the wrist of the bride with his right hand, and what the iconographic, is there an iconographic significance here? I could answer that question.
I had noticed.
Okay, well, I think I have an answer in that if you're going to the underworld, you're going to the left, which is the unlucky side in Greek. Just as battle victors, are going to the right. If you're going to the left, it's the unlucky side. And if Hermes is going to the left, he inevitably has to use his left hand as he, looks back to grab the chariot or whatever. And in bridal scenes, of course, you want the outcome to be good, so they inevitably move towards the right, so it makes sense that you might use your right hand. Anyway.
I would like to add something here. We always hear about Pamphilos of Amphipolis. Everybody's saying here he actually worked in Sicyon, not in Macedonia, yes. But everybody's saying, oh, geez, we have a Macedonian painter. Amphipolis was not a Macedonian city, it was a Greek city. And the Macedonians conquered it. And also it was a Thracian city to begin with. It was in Thrace, and it was conquered by Philip II. Anyhow, Pamphilus didn't work there. He did all his work in Sicyon, so I would never call him a Macedonian painter.
Well, it's like Polygnotos. He was from Thassos, but his major works were elsewhere. There's a question about the crowning motif by Joseph Miller. Thank you, many thanks for your talk. I'm interested in the motif of crowning in the paintings you discuss. You mentioned crowning for athletic victors and for Hellenistic kings. Does crowning occur as a funerary motif or with funerary connotations more widely?
Actually, I'm not aware of funerary connotations for crowning. It's usually victory at war or victory in games, but I can't think of any other funerary pictures where we have the crowning of the dead.
There are some in Bulgaria. There are a couple of.
What period? What is the period?
The 3rd century. After the Macedonians. I mean, after the Vergina ones. Most of the major tombs in Bulgaria, the Thracian tombs, have scenes with the deceased, presumably the deceased, being crowned by a woman. There's one. This Vestari tomb shows the Caryatid.
Oh, there's only one Vestari. Yes, but I have published an article, which is not yet. It has not yet appeared, but I suggest that Vestari is exactly the same thing as the Bella tomb. Yeah. That we have the king of the Thracians being crowned by the priestess, who meets him at the gates of the city when he returns from a campaign. So it's absolutely the same motive.
Yeah, true. Vestari and Bella look very much alike. Vestari and Bella look very much alike too.
And I think they saw the same thing.
A question from Julia Shear. Following up on that question about the variety of images, should we imagine that these tombs were built while the deceased was still alive, or are the tombs being built by the families?
I think both would be correct. In some cases, they would be built by the person. In other cases, maybe when he died unexpectedly, we would think the family created the tomb afterwards. But I think both is possible. Both cases are possible.
There are a couple of questions about Antigonos Gonatas. There is a question by someone who wants to clarify whether you believe that Tomb 2 of Vergina belongs to Antigonos Gonatas. Now, I lost the question, but I'm sure this is what it was asked. I know the answer to that, but perhaps you can give it yourself.
No, I don't believe so. We believe that Antigonos Gonatas actually covered Tomb 2 in Vergina with a tumulus because it had been plundered by the Gaulish mercenaries of King Pyrrhus of Epirus. And after the mercenaries were removed, someone made a new mound over the tombs in order to protect them. And the general idea is that Antigonos Gonatas did this. But of course, the tombs in there are much earlier than Antigonos Gonatas.
And of course, you have published the paper already mentioned by Professor Niles, arguing that the occupant of Tomb 2 in Vergina was someone else, not Philip II, but Philip.
But it's still 4th century, so it's not Antigonos Gonatas.
Now, going to the other question about Antigonos Gonatas, by Francesco Maria Ferrara. Hello, may I ask, is it possible, according to the interpretation of the depicted iconography and the presence of the throne, that the Bella tomb could be the burial place of King Antigonos Gonatas?
I do not remember. I already said it.
yeah, I do not remember if the tomb was looted in antiquity or not, and if there is material evidence from the tomb. But is it not strange, the position of the tomb off from the royal clusters? And what about the fact that from archaeological and literary sources, it seems that Aegae was the burial place of the Macedonian kings from the beginning, since the Temenid dynasty, and not the Antigonid? That's the whole question.
We don't know that. We know that there was a legend that the Argead dynasty would be extinct if they stopped burying them at Aigai. But the thing is, we have two royal tombs just outside the royal palace of Vergina, and they're both 3rd century. They have to be royal tombs. It's the tomb of the so-called tomb of Eurydice and the so-called tomb of Romaios, the archaeologist, because he excavated it. They are very, very close to the palace, and they both contain thrones. And I think everyone agrees that they're royal tombs, and they're way past the Argead dynasty. So I think it's possible that the kings of Macedonia continued to be buried in Vergina, perhaps not all of them. I am sure that some of the tombs in Pella can also be royal, but I don't think we can be sure that no king is buried in Vergina in the 3rd century.
Thank you. A question from Eleni Zimi. Hello, Eleni. Fascinating lecture, thank you. If the artists were itinerant, would that mean that the paintings of the tombs were planned well in advance and executed while people were still alive? How soon would the artists reach Macedonia from southern Greece to paint these tombs? This is an argument towards what you just said about Macedonians building their own tombs while still alive.
I don't know how soon you reach Macedonia on horseback, but it shouldn't be too bad. I don't know, maybe a week. And we also have some very fine paintings in Magna Graecia. So some of these people also went there and painted. It's really quite diffused, this painting. But I think sometimes you commission your own tomb when you're still alive, but sometimes you die very suddenly, and then your family would invite the artists to do the tomb for you. And there is a very interesting literary source. It's Arrian, who says that Alexander the Great wrote his will, which was read to the soldiers after his death. And in this will, he said he was planning to do a new tomb for his father Philip, which was going to be in the shape of a pyramid. I don't know why he didn't do it while he was still in Macedonia, but obviously he had seen the pyramids in Egypt, he had seen the mausoleum in Halicarnassus, and he was very jealous of these monuments, so he wanted to embellish his father's tomb with a big overground monument. So these tombs could also be built after your death.
And another question about iconography. The choice of an iconography related to the mystery cults of the Greek world is up to the owner of the tomb, or it could be attributed to the influence of a non-Macedonian artist. Do you think that artists had that power over the iconography of the monuments?
I'm sure the Macedonians had the first say in this, because the Athenians never showed any mysteries in their tombs. That is very clear in my talk, that the Macedonians seized an iconography that was not meant to be in funerary monuments and put it there. I think they took iconography from sanctuaries and transplanted it to tombs. Therefore, I believe that the patrons are responsible for what you see in these paintings, and not the artists.
And two questions about materials. The first one is from Konstantinos Papamichalopoulos. Is the choice of richer colors affected by the access to funds and the means at the disposal of those that commission the paintings?
Yes, many of the colors are very expensive. So clearly the patrons had a lot of money to spend, not only on the fees of the artists, but also on buying expensive paint.
And the second question is much, much more technical. It is interesting that the white color of some of the Macedonian paintings in tombs is derived from the natural mixture of some minerals in the Aliakmon River location, southeast of Kozani. Do you have any comments on that?
No, I'm afraid no.
This follows from research by Panagiotis Karkanas at the school itself.
I have no comment on that.
But I suppose it makes sense to have local pigments used mostly, and as technical research has shown, some of it is imported, like the cinnabar in one of the tombs you showed. For example, the Palmet tomb has a lot of cinnabar on it, yeah, I suppose it makes some sense. A question from Ilias Koulakiotis about the thrones, which is a very interesting feature of those tombs. Do thrones always, he asked, imply a royal identity and function? What are your thoughts on that?
Yes, I have written an article exactly arguing that the tombs, we only have marble thrones in Vergina, in a very few tombs, and I think they always indicate that the person buried there is a king, because Alexander the Great is the person who introduced the royal throne into the idea of royalty in Greece and Macedonia. Until then, we don't have any mentions. We don't have thrones except for priests and gods. And suddenly, from Alexander onwards, we have the royal throne, which of course comes from Persia. It's the great king of Persia who used the royal throne, and it was invested not only with the royalty, but also with divine powers. And I think this idea is transplanted into Macedonia through Alexander. And that's why we find these thrones in Vergina. But these thrones are Greek thrones, they are not Persian thrones. And they remind us of the thrones of the gods, because of course, once they arrive in Greece, they're no longer Persian thrones. But I have written extensively on this concept that the throne indicates royalty. So I think all the tombs with thrones in Macedonia are royal.
Do you think there's a gender distinction between tombs containing a throne and tombs that do not?
I think it's a man. If you have a throne, it's the king, not the queen. So definitely there are male burials, although sometimes you would have the wife buried in there with the king.
So the Eurydice tomb would belong to a man?
I think so, but they found two male skeletons and a female skeleton. So yes, I think it belongs to a man.
Okay.
And it's a king because it's just outside the palace.
Certainly. Two questions about the underworld again. Do you think that the funerary paintings you talked about are introducing the visitor to a different perception about the dead in the underworld?
I don't think this perception is different from what people feel in, say, Athens. No, the perception is the same, except until we see it in Macedonian art, we only knew this kind of thing from literature. But the Macedonians decided to give it a visual representation. Until then, we only knew it from Plato and other literary authors. And then suddenly it appears also in art. And of course, Aristophanes, he discusses it quite a lot, but in a very humorous way.
And the second question from Katerina Psatha. Thank you for the great presentation. What is the main dramatic element or component painters think about in order to create an afterlife illustration? Is the presented personality, is the personality of the people represented, or something else?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
I think the point is the deceased himself or herself and his or her personality the main element of the pictorial story, or something that goes besides it? Obviously, you argued for all this philosophical prose and the metaphysics of it. So I suppose.
Well, if we take the tomb of Persephone, we don't see the owner of the tomb. But we realize that the owner of the tomb believed in the mysteries of Persephone and Demeter. We don't know, however, anything about his or her personality, and it's impossible to know if it was a man or a woman. Because in this tomb, they found both a man and a woman and lots of children. So we don't really know who was originally buried there. In the tomb, the Bella tomb, where we have the warrior, there is no doubt that it's the personality of the dead person who is highlighted. So it depends very much on the iconography to give you an idea whether they begin with the beliefs of the dead person or his personality, and they want to highlight what he was in life.
Thank you. I think now it's time to go back to Professor Niles for a comment or a question. And
Okay. Well, we're peppering you with questions, Olga, so I hope you're holding up. But I want to go back to crowning for a minute, because you said, you know, it's athletes and military victors, but of course in Athens we have the law against tyranny, where we have demokratia, maybe crowning Demos, who's enthroned. I wondered if you want to, and of course we know there was a painting of that subject, maybe by Euphranor, but so I wondered if you wanted to comment on that. And then there was a question in the chat about, do you think these crowns, or the one case in the Bella tomb, represent or allude to, of course, the ubiquitous gold leaf crowns that we find, you know, in Macedonian tombs with the cremated dead?
I think the crowns can be understood in many different ways. They are the crowns of the initiated, or they are the crowns of the people who participate in rituals. And the coronations in Athenian art, it's the coronation of the person who is the benefactor of the city. Therefore, I think the coronation of Demos by democracy. And it has this idea that Demos is benefiting democracy. And we have a relief that I originally wanted to show in my talk, but then it became too long. It's the famous relief of Demeter, Persephone, and Plutos. Persephone is crowning Plutos because Plutos brings the riches of the agricultural produce to mankind, and therefore he is a benefactor of men and women. So the idea of crowning someone is also the idea of thanking your benefactor, which is very, very evident in document reliefs of the 4th century in Athens. So I don't think that is all that evident in Macedonia. In Macedonia, you crown the military victor so far. And in Thrace also, we have 2 instances of crowning, and in both cases, I think it's a king who won at wars, and that's all. We don't have the religious element in there. But I think the crowns that we find in tombs are more religious, because you remember in the tomb of the philosophers, every single figure in there has a crown. And they wear crowns because they are in a religious ceremony. They are reading sacred texts, and that's why they have crowns. Of course, you also wear crowns in symposia as well. There are many meanings to the crown, and it depends on the context.
I was also interested. Go ahead. No, go ahead,
Sorry,
Dimitris.
I suppose this could be a good explanation of Macedonian painting, because there's a great variety, and each monument is different from everything else. The different tendencies and different approaches to the iconography.
I think Macedonia is like Paris. In Paris, you see Picasso, who is from Spain, and you see people from Russia. They're painting from all over the world, and they're different. And that's what happened to Macedonia. They had lots of money, and they attracted international figures who bring their own cultures to embellish the art of Macedonia. I think that's what's happening. And the Macedonians are very open. They really accept a lot of different influences, and they like to develop them. So hat to the Macedonians.
And just one more question regarding the iconography of the so-called Philip's tomb. In what sense is this question from Evgenia Alexiou? How is the hunting scene on the well, it's not a pediment anyway, is associated with a funerary iconography?
It isn't. Again, it is adapted from a non-funerary iconography. The hunting scene reflects, I think, court life. If you live at court, you follow your king to the hunt. And if you have hunted with your king, you're very privileged and you want to show off. And so the hunt is not a funerary scene. It's part of the life of the elite. That's the way I would explain it.
Well, thank you.
I have one last comment here. I mean, it's my own comment, but I'm interested in the idea that these facades represent gateways to the underworld. And, you know, in the case of the Bella tomb, maybe the benefits gained by getting to Rhadamanthys, but it reminds me of actually portals of medieval cathedrals, where you have the Last Judgment as a very common motif, which is a warning, you know, that on the bad side you're going to go burn in hell, and on the good side you're going to be lifted out of your grave hole and go up to heaven. But clearly, you know, it's the same kind of, somewhat of the same idea, that this entrance is taking you to the afterlife, and hopefully a good afterlife, which is, I guess, the way the Macedonians wanted to represent it.
The new museum in Vergina opens because there is a very nice new big museum being prepared. They have reconstructed the gateway to the palace, and it looks exactly like the facade of the Judgement tomb, because it has 2 stories, and the top story has false windows with half columns, exactly like the Lefkadia tomb.
Yeah. So in that case, I mean, that would argue against this idea of the underworld, but that it's the entrance to a palace or a princely dwelling or something like that. But
yes, it's a gateway to the palace.
Yeah, okay.
But it happens to be also the gateway to the palace of the underworld.
Of the Hades, yes, and of course, and we do have sort of very minimal representations of the gateway to Hades in Attic vase painting much earlier, but, you know, it's always a column. When Heracles goes down to steal that Cerberus, there's columns there, you know, and a somewhat of temple-looking facade. So anyway, this has been a very rich lecture, as Dimitris said, and we thank you very much. I'm sure there will be more comments coming to you personally, but everyone has said what an excellent lecture it is, and we really appreciate your doing it. I appreciate all the previous lectures in this program, and I want to thank them and our great audiences, our huge audiences. This is a wonderful opportunity for the outreach of the American School of Classical Studies in Athens, and we're delighted that you all attended and responded so well to this lecture series. Someone asked again about the Corinth. I'm afraid there were some issues at Corinth with the conservators not being there, so we weren't able to film those paintings, but we hope to do so at a later date and get that back on our program. If you do go to our website, you will find all future events listed, upcoming webinars or lectures and whatever, including a virtual gala for the first time for the American School on May 6th. So check that out. And again, and I want to particularly thank my co-moderator here, Professor Dimitris Plantzos, who I again recommend to you his wonderful book on Greek painting, beautifully illustrated, and you can dig much deeper into the whole range of Greek paintings by looking at his book. So it's been wonderful having him join us, and we hope to see all of you again in future programs. Thank you.